I think everyone's here and we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking time out on a busy Monday to join us. I'm Aparna Jacob, Director of Studies for Academic English Pathways at UNSW College, and it is such a pleasure for me to be hosting this conversation with Brett Blacker. Brett, of course, needs no introduction whatsoever, and after 8 incredible years in service to our sector, will be signing off as CEO of English Australia. I've had the immense privilege of working directly with Brett, both as my boss when I was part of the English Australia Secretariat, and then as a director on the English Australia board with Brett, of course, as our CEO. So in today's conversation, what we're hoping to do is have Brett share some of his insights over this remarkable period of leading the sector, particularly through the pandemic, and of course, give us some guidance on the many advocacy conversations that are still very much active this year. And I believe will continue well into the next year and perhaps the year after that. Just a quick note before we begin, we will have time for audience Q&A towards the end. So please feel free to pop those questions you have into the Q&A section below, and we'll get to that towards the end. So over to Brett now. Brett, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for this conversation. Shall we start with a quick pulse check, perhaps? So my first question really is, as our outgoing CEO, how are you feeling as we get to the end of this massive year?
Thank you, Aparna, and absolute pleasure to be with you today. And yeah, I guess pulse check. I guess it's an interesting period for the sector, and right now as the outgoing CEO, I guess my big focus is on making sure that English Australia is well prepared for what lies ahead. I guess it's with both an element of excitement personally, looking at the new challenges that are going to be coming ahead personally, professionally, but equally as a pulse check, it also comes with mixed emotions, leaving a wonderful organization and a great community of people. So looking forward to today's session and being able to maybe dive into a few of the current issues and then talk about those in a little bit more depth.
Brett, I think mixed emotions is very much the mood of the moment. Even across the sector, but maybe jumping into our first question, the last 3 years, particularly for the sector, have been incredible. And they've been so busy. There's never been a dull moment. In terms of English Australia's advocacy efforts, things have really ramped up this year. And there are so many live conversations in terms of policy changes, regulatory activities, and so on. What are some of those live conversations as of November, December 2023, and that you see will continue next year?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aparna, I guess the analogy that one of our government colleagues used at the English Australia conference was right now that there are a lot of planes in the air, and I think in the role of the peak bodies and myself and our other colleague peak bodies, we are doing our very best to try and land those planes on the right runway and avoid delays in terms of traffic control, and make sure that all in all we get everyone down safely. In that, I guess, to take away and be a bit more direct, we've had incredible number of reviews. I'm sure many, if not everyone on this webinar or looking at the recording is aware of the reform processes that are being discussed under the migration review, the inquiry into international education and tourism, the outcomes of the Nixon review, in running in parallel, the universities accord discussions, and to the backdrop of processes before that, which we're looking at reform processes to the ESOS framework, stemming from the period of coming out back into the return to compliance as well. So there undoubtedly is a lot, and within that, we're even seeing in the media over this past weekend, a heightened focus on international education, and particularly in some ways, what will most likely feed into the upcoming election next year, and more of an emphasis around migration.
Brett, absolutely. Particularly on the weekend, there was so much activity in media focused on some of those hot button topics, which could well become election conversations very quickly about international students. So I guess that leads us into looking ahead for 2024. Yep. Challenges, certainly, but also opportunities. Would you like to talk to some of those points specifically, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess maybe looking at that first one, and as you said, picking up on probably what's the most recent element. One thing that I think we've seen in terms of Australia and the way Australia's sort of operating, there is a lot of broader economic issues on the table. And even within the opinion polls, looking at the current government, it is at a time when it's been questioned in terms of some of its policy and decision making. And so it will, as a government, be looking at what needs to be put in place ahead of a runway through to their next election, likely to be towards the end of next year. On that, the hot topics that are present have obviously been those around interest rates, those around inflation, and those two I's have kind of dominated public discourse. What we're going to see, in my view, and this is what I think was sort of the first signal over the weekend, was that third I coming into play around immigration. And then the only fourth one after that would be infrastructure and government spending. But looking at that third I, in particular, immigration and net migration, it's a really topical decision, and we've seen that play out in different elections globally, and the influence that it has on an election outcome. Remembering, I guess, back from when we have had our borders reopen, the current government were supportive in many ways of rebound for the international education sector. That period of visa-free visas initially being issued, the extended work rights in terms of that period of extended work rights, and probably to a lesser favourable extent, the 408 activity visa, which thankfully has been closed, but again stimulated the market. Equally, the government dedicated, as an outcome of last year's Jobs and Skills Summit, significant resourcing towards ensuring that the Department of Home Affairs had appropriate labour force in terms of processing officers to be able to handle the volume of applications. And so acknowledging we've kind of had a number of stimulus messages and packages or support, which has fueled and supported our sector to recover to the extent that it has. And we needed to recover, particularly on the back of the devastating international border closures. But right now, Aparna, that's being really pressed upon, particularly with some of the other issues that are leaning into being put on migration and immigration, and that being on rental crisis, which is again another issue that's affecting the broader economy. And unfortunately, one of the more probably eligible or simple levers for the government to pull will be in potentially in the student visa program. And I think that's where our biggest risk lies, particularly running into 2024.
And Brett, certainly, there's a couple of things in there that I want to acknowledge. Some of those gains made and messages and support that we saw from the government was largely in response to some of our advocacy efforts, particularly lots of effort on your part to bring a new government into the picture, but also the previous government to support. You've clearly identified some of those challenges that are coming up for us that we need to look at, particularly the student visa processes, the migration, which could go in a number of directions to perhaps check this unprecedented growth we've seen in the student numbers, which has been great for recovery. Opportunities, though, what are you seeing? Yeah, well, it's a great point.
I think when we look back at the period of the pandemic in particular, and one of the probably most pertinent outcomes or notable outcomes for us was the transition in terms of online teaching. Now, I know it's a very topical discussion, particularly in terms of onshore, and we've seen the sector reverting back to the standards which existed pre-pandemic around online teaching, not being part of the prescribed 20 hours per week here in Australia. I guess, Aparna, as we look through, and particularly if there's a tightening of migration settings, and it be that temporary migration through the student visa program or others, it does provide, I guess, a backdrop for where some of those innovations and new technologies that we saw emerge out of necessity during the pandemic potentially come back in terms of the way in which we may need to activate those teaching methodologies, both in the offshore market or in a preparation market of students coming here as well.
And Brett, this is hopefully complementary with the government's agenda for innovation in our education and international education space, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, totally. And we saw that coming through in the initial, I guess, messaging that was sort of post-pandemic. And it's funny how we cycle through and sort of quickly forget some of the things that were front of mind this time last year around the potential ESOS reforms process. And as we were reverting back to, at end of October last year, it was when the return to compliance protocols had been announced. And subsequent to that, we'd started the ESOS reform process. It's kind of been overshadowed in the past almost 12 months by the, I guess, more headline government reviews. But in the backdrop of that, the government was obviously investigating the potential for a variance in terms of online teaching. And within that, some of the things that we were calling for particularly were how those methodologies were being defined. And so I guess in some ways, what's been fortunate is we haven't rushed to a policy or a regulatory change in some settings that didn't have the appropriate definitions behind them. And I think the real risk that we saw, whilst sort of the future of ELICOS research was indicating that there was an appetite for greater diversity in types of teaching, we needed to have those quality assurance frameworks, and we needed to have the right regulatory standards to make sure that the way in which that was delivered was an even playing field across the sector as well.
Yeah. So Brett, my understanding from what you're saying is the overshadowing of some of these initiatives means some of these conversations around diversification of modes, etc., are on hold until some of those other bigger issues are settled, correct?
Yeah, that's right, Aparna. And I think on hold's the right language, because there is, other work in the policy landscape that's happening right now. And, we've seen quite significant developments or drafting of items that are going to be coming through more focused on sort of the integrity landscape, which are as a direct result of those reviews. And it's my understanding that even in the coming sort of weeks, the Department of Education will release an issues paper looking at some of those items, particularly in terms of the integrity measures, and that may, I think, be pushed through quicker than some of the other ESOS reform processes that were on the table prior.
Yeah. So quality students, quality agents, and some of those integrity issues, as you say, are things we can look forward to continuing conversations on, seeing something pretty quickly, I guess, first.
Yeah. I mean, there's an enormous amount of discussion happening in terms of international education agents. And to be honest, I mean, we as a sector are incredibly reliant on high quality, really well engaged international education agents, and they have a really important, if not critical role to play in the way our sector operates. Obviously, from a government's perspective, it's kind of one of those areas which broadly in the Australian landscape is unregulated as an education entity, albeit that responsibility sitting back with the education provider. But certainly it's a space at the moment that the government is looking to expand agent data and the transparency, particularly of what is accessible for providers to be able to see in terms of the way in which agents are operating and their success measures. There's a further ongoing dialogue, and with particularly ICEA that's looking at the way in which agent regulation and self-regulation can be done more broadly. And I know the government particularly is looking at ways in which either the sector looks to either regulate and support international education agents, of which many are committed to education and training and do wonderful support mechanisms like that through which offered through ISEF and other organisations which have tools, but more broadly in international education agents are a hot topic that something is likely to come down.
Absolutely, Brett. And with our reliance on agents in our sector, this is a space that everyone is going to be watching very closely. So understand that there's more news coming in just, I guess, the next couple of months. I just want to also say thank you for outlining some of those hot topics and issues for us, because as we said, there is so much happening in that space. We did need you to connect some of those dots for us. So I'm sure everyone on this call and on this webinar appreciates you doing that. Brett, I just want to take a minute and go back to 2015. We're looking back now on perhaps your first day in the office, which I remember really well. And it's been 8 years since then. I think it was August 2015 when you first came into the office, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So much has happened, and I know you were part of international education, so not completely new to the sector. And yet understanding ELICOS, its people and its values has been a very large part of your journey. I was just going to get you to reflect on some of your learnings about our sector, our people, and our values.
Great question, Aparna. Yes, well, thank you. And as noted, I had broad experience in international education and particularly other work in international education associations with IEAA. But coming into this role was my first sort of in-depth experience in the ELICOS sector. So to reflect on that journey, people and values, just probably the first term that would come to mind that would sort of give maybe some overarching descriptor of it would be inclusivity. And it's an interesting word because, for someone coming from the outside, you need that level of support to be able to be effective. The thing that I've found most rewarding in this position has been the connection with the people. And, I think that the successes that English Australia has had during my time and prior to that, which, I acknowledge I was really fortunate to be able to join an organisation that was in a really good position. And, the work that successive boards and my predecessor, Sue Blundell, had undertaken meant that English Australia had a really good platform for me to be able to work on or work upon. But, the engagement from our members and as that inclusivity, I think, probably comes down to the nature of the work that we do, that, caringness and attentiveness to that student experience for those that come with a different set of educational needs. Language as a barrier can make people more vulnerable, as we know, but equally it's such an enabler that I think that passion that our teachers have, the support from those communities shines through in the people. So being able to work in this role and all the other activities that we've had to do, I can sort of elaborate on. Inclusivity would certainly be one that would stand out. If I may just go a little bit deeper on that, there is certainly a passion to the work that people do across the ELICOS sector, and I think that also shines in terms of their willingness to engage. And I probably didn't want to use engage as its own, because I think when I talk about these other terms, it comes through. And so that passion, for people to want to learn more in terms of participating, being part of special interest groups, being part of attendance at workshops or conferences and events, but equally being prepared to also share and be engaged in terms of what they're doing, and sharing that passion with others in terms of best practice as well. And not to be cliche, but I think it would be remiss not to acknowledge the resilience. It probably gets used so much at the moment, but we referred back earlier just to the level of hardship that our sector took through the pandemic, and that experience, as we've noted previously, student numbers which were lower than they were on record, going back more than 20 years. And then to think that we've come through with very low number of providers ceasing trading, and then yet an entire enthusiasm for people to innovate and then come back to where we are as I think a really well established, or should say redefined sector now. That certainly showed through in terms of the character of the people across our sector.
Brett, I just want to thank you for taking some time to unpack this for us, because it is very powerful as a CEO if you're able to call out these values, which largely remain intangible for a sector. But I think you're absolutely right, particularly over the last few years. Some of these values have really come to the forefront to become so much more tangible. I love the resilience piece that you call out, because we've always known the sector was resilient, but the true test of it over the last 3 years has really proven how resilient we are, how innovative we are. I love the fact that you've added inclusivity. A lot of people have found homes in ELICOS and continue to stay here. And it's wonderful that you felt that when you came in as well. And, that's why we are such a beautiful, inclusive sector, the connections. Now, I guess the reason I wanted to acknowledge this and the engagement was because in many ways, some of your work has been a direct reflection of building on the values that the sector has at its core. And it's actually given momentum to some of the English Australia initiatives we have run. On that note, can I just ask you about any of the milestones? And there were so many in the last 8 years that stick out in your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Aparna. Gosh, milestones over the period, there are a lot. It's interesting when you go back to that 2015 period. I probably want to call upon something shortly after my arrival, and it was an initiative that I had the good fortune of picking up a project that was already sort of in process. But the biggest English lesson back in April 2016 on Bondi Beach, where I proudly acknowledge that as a group of providers that banded together across particularly New South Wales in this instant, for us to achieve a Guinness World Record for the biggest English lesson on Bondi Beach, and attended by the Minister for International Education at the time, which again was another milestone in terms of recognition for our sector. Some of that good news story that we needed in the community at that time as well. And again, a really lovely experience for students, participants, and colleges to come together. So as an initial kind of launchpad project, that was something that I'll always remember. Perhaps less in terms of specific activity, but the probably second thing that springs to mind for me was the development of our CPD framework, which at the time, Aparna, you'll recall, when we first launched it, and I must acknowledge, your work, but the incredible work of Sophie O'Keefe in terms of taking this initiative from what at the time was, what we thought a missing link, a gap within our sector for the professionalism of our teaching community, a way in which English Australia would be able to guide our CPD offerings or our professional development offering, but equally to try and enable teachers and their peers to be able to have a more guided process of professional development. And, we've seen that develop from what was, nothing in some ways, an idea with, the generosity of groups of people from across our member network who have participated in the initial sort of focus groups and design, and more recently in the redesign. Too many people to sort of call out individually, but I think as perhaps not necessarily a milestone, but as something that I think is a really valuable contribution to the way in which our sector has grown and developed and continues to do so, would be around the CPD framework. If I may, I think the innovation funds would be something that on a personal level was one of the most proudest achievements in terms of this position, and what I think the effectiveness of how English Australia was able to work with the government, with the federal government in particular, to be able to gain access to specific resources and funding, which I know wasn't able to be accessed by everyone, but I equally know for those that were able to gain, be granted the Innovation Fund or Innovation Development Fund to be able to utilise those resources during the time of the pandemic, to be able to try and redefine their business models and keep operating. It was a really challenging period, but again, as you reflect back on some of those milestones, it's certainly one that, along with some of the other measures that we were able to support and enact during the time of the pandemic, that's certainly one that will sort of forever stay in my mind. So, there's a number of other activities, and probably a lot of it in the professional development space. And again, a lot of that I give credit to Sophie and the team that are behind those initiatives. But I'll probably stop there, and we can dive.
I think we can keep going with that list, because truly there were so many, and I think you've done well to pick a few key ones, Brett. I might add the visibility of data for the sector has been a very big one. Just as you said, the professionalism of the sector was a very important one, for which, there was a vision for the CPD framework that Sophie has certainly, I call her the midwife of the CPD framework. But the fact that the SIGs, the CPD framework, all of these work in harmony, brings our sector together in terms of a group of professionals whose professionalism is acknowledged formally. The data similarly gives insights for businesses and our membership to make the right decision. So I just wanted to add that to your long list as well, Brett. And I could see as you were talking, you were truly going down memory lane, because there were so many moments, over the years that had to be called out, worked on very carefully. I'll just say to those attending, if you have any questions, Sophie's just reminded us to put it down in Q&A. I'll move to my next question, Brett, just on those initiatives, right? A lot of these initiatives that you called out has also been about getting visibility for the sector, whether it's professionalizing it, putting it on the government's radar. A lot of this comes back to the incredible advocacy work that you've been leading. And you've been a tremendous leader for us as a CEO, but also as a mentor, friend for the sector. and a champion for the sector. I think the ability to influence our governments, and there've been a few, and lots of different ministers for education in particular that you've had to work closely with over the years. So I do want to acknowledge that you've been particularly effective in the advocacy space, in the ability to influence. I'm not going to ask you what's your secret, but what makes you particularly effective? And do you have any thoughts on how this relationship works and how it will continue to work in future? Do you have any insights?
Yeah, thanks, Aparna. And I appreciate you calling out those other aspects of the data as well. And again, I know English Australia has a really rich and long history in terms of its position with data. A separate project, sorry, just off tangent for a moment, but when we've recently had our 40th anniversary and going back down that trip of memory lane, looking back at the history of the way English Australia was at the forefront of so many initiatives which have been adopted by other industry associations, given our 40-year history, but equally other global international education associations in the English language space. And one of those particularly that they've tried to model or indeed try to emulate where possible has been around our data collection. And so, I think it's good to acknowledge we have that long history in this area, but using data was really effective in the way we were able to get support and leveraging that data. And this is where the response from each one of our members and other providers that participate in those annual ELICOS surveys is so powerful when you're able to aggregate that together and then look at other aspects of economic performance and various other questions. And in that really difficult patch, the way we were able to then do those separate economic impact reports, the reason was, I guess, trying to reverse engineer as we engage with those particular decision makers, what was the intel that we needed to be able to voice the issue. And over time, that changes. And if we look back historically, some of the other things that English Australia has been able to really do well is, we've had times when the work that we did was really focused on the issue of mental health. And some of our resources and guides, the program that was funded for teachers across Australia to be able to access mental health training was speaking to what was particularly, and not to say it's not a need now, but it was a really identifiable point in time when there was some issues and things that needed that training and support. And I guess, Aparna, if I was to look back at effective advocacy, I think it's, to be effective, you've probably got to understand the issues well. And that's where I've been lucky, incredibly fortunate that our members have been so inclusive, so engaged. The fact that they will reach out and let me know if there's a problem on the horizon, albeit today. I've had members call today to talk through things that are happening in the migration space. And equally through time, the way in which we engage with our branch network, through the board, and I'll acknowledge the board later. But to be an effective voice, you have to really understand the issues and understand the issues well. And so, again, I reference my good fortune because people have been very generous in terms of giving that insight and that feedback to what needs to then be discussed. Then, I guess, on the flip side, English Australia and our history has given us a seat at the table so that when you're in those positions, you're able to effectively engage with the right decision makers and picking out those points. For me, I think that there are as equal many flaws that come along in the way my style will be put out as there are strengths, but probably humility and the ability to acknowledge a mistake to have a bit of a laugh, or know that you're not perfect is probably a good part of that process to being equally effective as well, Aparna.
We love that you're so transparent, Brett, always upfront, and the humility piece I completely endorse, and we benefit from that as well. I love how you crystallized the approach to government through either data, but also tapping into that pulse of the sector to be so generous with data and information that helps you be effective in your role, so you can leverage that powerful seat at the table with the government and press key issues. There's a lot of strategy and thinking that goes on. And as you said, you will acknowledge the board in providing some of that direction. But this combination has made English Australia particularly powerful in some of the past few conversations we've had at the government level. So thank you for that. Brett, perhaps we're on the home stretch now. And while people are thinking of their questions for you, I do want to get a few final words from you in terms of our as an outgoing CEO, what would you like to say to our membership, but also to the incoming CEO, which I believe will be announced very soon? But any parting words or thoughts?
Thanks, Aparna. I guess maybe going into reverse on those questions, if that's okay. So yes, I think you're right. I think we will have an announcement around the incoming CEO very soon. And I guess in terms of the role, that person is very fortunate to come into an organisation that it's honestly it's one of the best roles you could take on ever. And I must admit, it was a really incredibly difficult decision to even step aside from this position. My words of advice around that is obviously probably to continue to listen, be really engaged with our members, and just ensure we continue to represent their voices as strongly as possible. I think that if I was to move back in terms of your questions and think about messages back to our members, well, there's an incredible amount of thanks from me to all of those items of support. And, I hope that in some ways for English Australia, as we've just noted previously, celebrating 40 years was such an incredible milestone. And I had the good fortune of being able to be part of that, particularly at our conference. And as we released the memorabilia booklet, as we captured the 40 voices, there are so many people that have contributed to the vibrancy, the success of our association and of our sector. And so, this role maybe gets to take a little bit more of a figurehead position, but it really is only because it's enabled by those other amazing people. And just on that, I did mention, I just wanted, if I can, I'm very, very fortunate to have the leadership from three incredibly great chairs, from Mark Wheaton Newstead, Cynthia Kralik, and Kerry Sutcliffe, who each have been incredibly supportive of the Secretariat and the role that we do, and equally provided great leadership to many people who across the boards, both general delegates and state delegates, all of our directors that over the past 8 years are just so passionate and really willing to make sure that the organisation is a success. So I'm thankful for that, and I'll wait to do my final close, and at that stage, it'll be all about the members.
Thank you, Brett. We might move to a couple of questions now, and please keep them coming. I guess the first question that's come through is about timelines of some of the activities to expect in the next couple of months. Again, going back to our initial advocacy piece and the number of activities that are happening in that space, Brett, what can we expect? Do we have a timeline that we might be able to talk to?
Yeah, thanks, Aparna. So initially, we've obviously at the moment we're dealing with recommendations from the major reports. The government has broadly accepted the majority of the recommendations from Nixon review, and so that's kind of publicly accessible. The next cab off the rank, which was expected, was the migration review, which we expected to be in this quarter, sort of the fourth quarter of 2023. It's always difficult to know whether these things will come through as slated, and if it's not now, it would be early in the new year. And again, giving enough time for once there's what's at the moment considered recommendations are then looked at how they would be potentially written into any policy or regulatory change if needed. Others could be more structural changes. And by that, I mean, if we looked back at the item of education agents, and if you to sort of look at that issue within migration, well, it's kind of referring to potentially an item where the Office of Migration Agents, OMARA, registered agents, would then have more scope to look at education agents as well. So that could be more of a structural change than necessarily policy or legislation. But as I'm in the education space, I think I noted earlier, we're expecting sort of in the next couple of weeks to have an issues paper looking at sort of a couple of the key items. And within that, it's more focused on sort of the integrity measures for fit and proper provider and some of the education agent items. So I think what we'll have is probably a rolling number of outcomes, be it towards the end of this year or early into 2024, which will sort of start to shape positions and items ahead of the election next year.
Thank you, Brett. And I know a lot of this information is still being discussed and is confidential, and that limits how much information the government's actually put out there as well. So appreciate you sharing what to expect. A couple of questions again coming through. One of the questions that constantly comes up for our sector is about the casualization and a very large casualized workforce. I guess one way to approach this, I'm wondering if some of the initiatives that English Australia has done to support the rapid growth of of colleges when we went through the V-shaped recovery, but also initiatives that were consciously put in place to attract more teachers to the sector. I wonder if you wanted to talk to the casualization and also some of the initiatives we put forward to support teachers.
Yeah, thanks, Aparna. And it's an ongoing point. I think, from if I was to look back again from day one, 2015, I think the casualization of our workforce was a hot topic back then as well. And the volume of our staff that were either seasonally or casually engaged is, I guess it's been a long-standing feature of the way in which English language in the ELICOS sector has been taught. Albeit, when coming out of the pandemic, and there's been a number of initiatives trying to bring teachers back, as interesting as it was and as difficult at those times, was for us. We equally had to change tack at English Australia and sort of focus on recruitment-driven initiatives and professional development for new teachers. English Australia was doing ads in Seek to try and drive teachers through to drive advertisements through our jobs board to get teachers back, or for colleges that were advertising on the English Australia website to promote their opportunities through those as well. So, and we created videos on why what the initiatives were, why you'd want to be an English language teacher, which was rewarding in its own right. Definitely within the fair workspace, casualization and the period of employment within casualization before a fixed term contract has been more sort of pertinent issue. And within the employment contract space as well, there's been a lot of more recent dialogue around how people, professionals, and including teachers, are engaged on employment contracts. It's probably fair to say it's a space that we could do more in, and perhaps it's one that, as we look to the next priorities of English Australia and a new strategic plan coming in the new year, then support for or looking at employment protocols within the sector could certainly be something that would be more of a focus.
Thank you, Brett. Another question, again, I know we've spent a little bit of time on this already, but just in terms of biggest opportunities and threats in the coming years, any quick responses to that?
So the biggest threats, I guess, over the weekend we saw the dialogue, which was noted through media, would be around a cap on international students. Now, what's interesting in that is when a statement such as putting a cap on the numbers is put into broadstream media, when it's not actually part of any political recommendation at the moment, that in itself is kind of a threat to some extent, because we have these numerous inquiries and reviews at play, yet you get this kind of curveball, which is looking at potentially putting a cap. Now, I think that without when a statement like that's put out there, the issue is everyone will dive to the lowest common denominator, the risk, the threat, the issue. And that's not to say that we, at this stage, have any clear or transparent view on what, if the government is clearly thinking of a cap. If it was to think of the cap, what number would that be? If it was a cap, how would that be implemented? There's so many things that would need to be done, thought through. However, the biggest risk is the fact that it starts to put out negative perceptions, of international education in Australia, more broadly into our communities and our offshore network. So I think the threat with some of these items is more around the way in which they're implemented and the perception around some of the items too. Then, I think as a collective, we've already recognised, the resilience. We've recognised the innovation. We know that, we can get through most things, be it through the cycle of it goes up, it'll go down, it goes up, it goes down. But what I think is probably more concerning is when you do get those broader philosophical impressions that the international education isn't welcomed. Unfortunately, that's what I think if we start to lose that social license in Australia, then to the extent that we can try and not pursue that further, then that's where I think that we'll have the biggest threat.
Thank you, Brett. And I think you did mention the 2 eyes, which then we said were 3 eyes and then 4 eyes. I think one of the dangers, as you've just said, is the conflation of some of these issues and directly relating them to international education or international students. For example, the interest rates, inflation, but also how migration affects housing prices, for example, and some of these factors, economic factors at play. Quite a dangerous conversation. And again, lots of nuance needed in these discussions. And thank God we have some great people to nuance these discussions, Phil Honeywood and others that are in the space to speak intelligently and in an informed manner about these issues.
Yeah, sorry, the last one, and I mean, Phil, and indeed, yesterday, like last night, that we had another article in the Australian, which Phil, Troy, from Iteca, and myself, responding to one item which we have to call out in the migration review, which is around the raising of English language standards. And I do want to note that English Australia has been at the forefront of discussions on this issue in many ways, immediately from when the migration review was released. And as they look to raise the minimum for package visas from 4.5 to 5, look to raise that for package entry from 5.5 to 6. English Australia took charge of that issue and engaged with all of our counter-peak bodies on top of our role meeting with the Migration Review Task Force and numerous meetings with the Minister's Office to try and ensure that each one of those stakeholder groups was aware that changes to the English language proficiency levels will have consequences and impact across all sectors. And so understanding the drivers for why, and again, coming back to those earlier comments about let's try to use data-driven evidence on student performance, academic performance elements that would necessitate this change has been part of our main drive. The thing that I think we do, you noted also, was that effective advocacy. And at times it's about what you can achieve somewhat behind the scenes in terms of steering this government dialogue, working with ministers' offices, working with the department to understand the impact before it gets implemented. Unfortunately, there are times when the use of media, for example, isn't necessarily the best mechanism. Yeah, because we need to have as a collective group of industry that support behind us, and if we can ensure that we do that with appropriate research, with the right people and timed appropriately, then it's often much more effective than just sort of going out scattergun on some of these issues. But it remains a live issue, and the way in which we're trying to navigate that is something that I'm working on, and will continue to do so. And I know English Australia will have it at the front of mind as well.
Thank you, Brett. We've got you until the 5th of Jan, which is good. And I know you'll be pressing hard on some of these conversations and keeping them going. So thank you. There's quite a bit of, a question about your next role, of which, I'm sure those saying goodbye to you are very interested to know. Did you want to comment on that?
Thank you, Aparna. Yes, so I guess I'm fortunate to the extent that my time working with international education, my time working with English Australia has been incredibly rewarding. So I'm very fortunate that I'm going to be taking a role that will enable me to stay connected with the industry, and I think we'll make an announcement of that just prior to me leaving the organisation. But I won't be going too far, but I certainly look forward to being able to engage with our people, our wonderful colleagues across the sector in that new capacity in the future.
Thank you, Brett. And it's nice to know you're not going too far. Brett, I know you wanted to have the last word, but I wanted to, on behalf of our sector, just say a couple of words before I hand over to you to close. Brett, a big thank you on behalf of all of us for steering the ship, although I like to say driving the bus, and you know why, it's an inside joke. It certainly hasn't been smooth sailing, but you're leaving us in a position of strength, and this is credit to all your hard work and dedication and very generous contribution to us as individuals and also as a sector. Like myself, there are so many of us that have benefited from having you as a boss, a mentor, a colleague, and also a friend, if I can say that. And really, it's been a privilege. So thank you, Brett. We're going to miss you, but we wish you the very best for this next bit of your journey. So again, a collective thank you.
Very, very kind. Thanks, Aparna. And I'd probably echo all of those sentiments, in terms of you've just outlined. I acknowledged a little bit earlier, the wonderful support that I'd had from, the English Australia board, from the chairs, the deputy chairs, executive, committee members, and all of those board members over the years who have been incredibly generous in terms of their support and their leadership, and to the broader membership. It's just good for us to acknowledge the work that they do on a continual basis for the success of English Australia. I'd love to take the opportunity to acknowledge Sophie O'Keefe, Kerry Corbin in our communications role, and Anthony Wasquito in our administrative officer role. As a small team, we work incredibly close together, and I think it's often noted we probably punch above our weight in terms of that group, but the synergy and effort is because I think we've again, we're all collectively really passionate about what we get to do for the sector as well. And very lastly, to all of our incredible members, throughout this webinar, I've noted the success that we've had truly comes from that inclusive nature, the engaged interaction, the willingness to give guidance and let us know what we need to do for you. And thank you for the support through that time as well. So again, I'm lucky I've got a few more weeks in the role, and I'll be coming out to a number of the branch meetings in that time. So I'd love the opportunity. If you can come along to the branch meetings, they're a great way for members to engage, to network, to share information, and to be part of that broader community of English Australia. So hopefully I get to see a few of you at those upcoming meetings, and please keep in touch. Greatly appreciated. Thanks, Aparna.
So many lovely messages coming through for you on chat, Brett. Please take a minute to have a look at them as well. So that brings us to the end of our discussion. I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming. And someone used the word enriching conversation this afternoon. But truly, Brett, thank you for sharing those insights. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon and the rest of the day. Thank you.